Hello and welcome to PsychBoost. In this video we'll be looking at the behavioural approach to explaining phobias. To do this we'll discuss how we acquire, so how we gain phobias, and how we maintain, how we keep phobias going. Some key terms for us in this video will be the two-process model and link into this classical and operant conditioning. So as you might remember, classical and operant conditioning comes from the behaviourist approach to psychology. So if you're a little vague in those terms, feel free to go back to the behaviourist video from the approaches section. We'll very briefly discuss some evaluative research, but we'll have a bunch of extension examples to use as well. So one key concept that behaviourists have is all behaviour, including phobias, is learned ultimately from interaction with the environment, so from experience. Now a really important term for this behaviourist approach to explaining phobias is the two-process model. This idea is from Maurer, and it suggests that phobias initially are first learned, so they're first acquired, through classical conditioning, so through association. They're then maintained through reinforcement, so through operant conditioning. That's the two-process model. The process of classical and operant conditioning working together to get a phobia and to keep it going. So the most complex part of this is the acquisition, how we gain phobias through classical conditioning. I'll explain it through for you now, I'll then give you an example, but if you're still a little unsure, please do go back to the behaviourist video, where I put a full diagram up of how learning by association works. So if we remember back, we have neutral stimuli. Now a phobic object will start as a neutral stimulus. A neutral stimulus won't produce a phobic response, it won't produce any response. But an unconditioned stimulus will produce an unconditioned response. Now a good example is a bite. A bite is painful and this will cause automatically a fear response. Now if for example it was a dog that bit you, the dog would have started as a neutral stimulus, but now the neutral stimulus has become associated with the unconditioned stimulus. Once this association has happened, fear will occur whenever the neutral stimulus appears. Now at this point the neutral stimulus is now the conditioned stimulus, and that fear response, originally the unconditioned response, is now the conditioned response. Another point to make about this conditioned response is it can also be passed on to other stimuli that are similar to the conditioned stimulus, but not the same. This is through a process of generalization. This is why it's quite common to have a fear of spiders, but also to have this fear generalized onto other insects like millipedes and beetles. So we suggest that phobias are maintained through operant conditioning. So operant conditioning is learning by trial and error. So a person with a phobia is aware they have this phobia and they might try and avoid scenarios which put them in contact with this phobic object. So you can imagine if someone has got a phobia and they're imagining a situation in the future which is going to put them in contact with the phobic object, they're going to start to feel anxious. Now if they can then avoid the situation, the anxiety will reduce, and that's a pleasant feeling, is the reduction of anxiety. That's then going to reinforce this phobia because there's a removal of this negative stimulus. Now under learning theories comes the behaviourist approach, but also comes social learning theory. Social learning theories also have a suggestion about how phobias are developed. They agree with the approach of classical and operant conditioning, but they also suggest that you can learn a phobia vicariously. So we view a model, and if we view the fear of other people, we might then go on to show the same display of fear, especially if that person's phobia is rewarded in some way. So for example, if they get attention by showing their phobia. And this would follow the same mediational process approach that we discussed in the social learning theory video. So let's break this down into a scenario. I can imagine it's quite likely that in a real exam, you might get a scenario of someone with a phobia and be asked to break down how they developed it, how they maintained it. So this is Laura and she has a phobia of bees. So when she was very young, Laura wasn't afraid of bees at all. She used to quite often play with them in the garden and try and attract them with jam. Bees for Laura start as a neutral stimulus, resulting in no fear response at all. However, when she was playing with them as a child, she accidentally put her hand over one of them. The bee stung her, and that sting produced a fear response. Laura then panicked and then started hitting the bees, and she got stung a few more times. She then associated the pain of being stung with the bees themselves, so then the bees became the conditioned stimulus, and she had a conditioned response of fear to them. And to this day, whenever she sees a bee, even though she hasn't been stung again, there's still this fear. Laura also found around this time she also became afraid of other insects, so she also became afraid of ants, moths, and also spiders, even though she's never been stung by any of those creatures. So her fear has been generalised. So that explains how phobia can be learned through classical conditioning, through association processes. Let's talk about maintenance. Another scenario, later in life, Laura's been invited to a summer picnic with her friends. She's been really looking forward to spending time with them, she hasn't seen them in a while. But as she gets to the park, she sees a number of bees floating around the bins. The thought of being surrounded by these bees starts to raise her anxiety, to the point where she calls her friends, she says there's been an emergency at home, and she just can't make it. She walks away from the park, and as she heads home, she's sad because she wants to spend time with her friends, but her anxiety decreases because she knows she doesn't have to spend time near the bees. So the phobia is reinforced. We might from this suggest that she's failed to function. She's not been able to engage with her social life like she would want to. The phobia really is affecting her day-to-day life. So here's some evaluations for this area of psychology. Now, the classic research by Watson and Rayner in 1920, which we go over in the behaviourist video, so look at that if you'd like a little bit more detail, you can't quite remember it, is the story of little Albert. So Watson demonstrated by how introducing a rat to a child, which it didn't have a phobic response to, but then pairing the display of this rat by hitting a large metal pole behind the child's head, could then induce a phobic response to the rat in the child. And it was also observed that phobias would then be generalised onto other similar objects, such as small dogs and fairy blankets. So there's fairly good evidence that behaviourist principles could be put into practice to generate a phobia. But of course we might criticise the ethics of this study, as it certainly caused little Albert emotional harm. Another interesting finding was by Mendes and Clark. So when they talked to children about their phobias of water, only 2% could actually recall an experience of water which caused this phobia. So as the behaviourist approach requires interaction with the environment in order to cause a phobia, the behaviourist approach alone on these results can't explain all phobias. Another thing to consider about the behaviourist explanation is we don't tend to have the most fear to the objects that cause us the most pain in day-to-day life. For example, when cooking, many people accidentally cut themselves with a knife. Phobias of knives are quite rare, whereas very few people are actually bitten by a snake. But phobias of snakes are quite high. One explanation for this difference could be an evolutionary explanation. Our very early ancestors, hunted by creatures like snakes, birds, dogs, tigers, it would make good evolutionary sense for us to have a natural instinct of fear to these creatures. But of course, this biological evolutionary explanation, this nature explanation for behaviour, goes against the nurture explanation provided by behaviourists. One positive evaluation is these behaviourist theories of formation and maintenance of phobias. They've gone on to produce really effective counter-conditioning therapies. The two we'll talk about in the next video are flooding and systematic desensitization. The fact that these therapies work so well is good evidence to support the behaviourist explanation for phobia formation and maintenance. So I hope you enjoyed this PsychBoost video. Please, if you haven't already, click subscribe. And if you enjoyed this video, give me a like. If you have any questions at all, pop them in the comment box and I'll try and get back to you. If you'd like the free resources that come with this course, I put the posters and some other things into this Dropbox link. Until the next video.